1447, Seville. A 23-year-old noble girl watches as her father and brother prepare to board a ship. Her father, Hernan Peraza, had inherited and bought all of the Canary Islands, conquered or not. Her brother Guillaume was eager to fight, hoping to have songs praising his victories. The girl wishes them both goodbye and waves as their boats become specks on the Atlantic horizon. One of these men she would be reunited with, the other would be dead within the year. This is the story of Ines Peraza, the self-proclaimed queen of the Canary Islands. Ines Peraza was born in 1424 in the city of Seville, which at that time was part of the Kingdom of Castile. She was named after her mother, Inés de las Casas. In 1391, her maternal grandfather, Juan de las Casas, becomes the first of many of her family to venture to the Canary Islands. It is through him that the claim to the unconquered islands of La Gomera, La Palma, Gran Canaria, and Tenerife are passed on to her brother, Guillaume Peraza. Her father, Hernan, would eventually sell his land in Castile for the ownership of the already conquered islands of El Hierro, Fuerteventura, and Lanzarote. His obsession with the Canaries would lead to the 1447 expedition that he would take with his son Guillaume. Hernan would set up his base on the island of Fuerteventura, while the young Guillaume Peraza would make an attempt at conquering the island of La Palma. After making a successful landing, Guillaume and his would-be conquistadors trek further into the island. Eventually, his small force is ambushed and Guillaume is hit in the head with a rock, dying instantly. Songs would still be sung about Guillaume, but not the triumphant ones that he had hoped for. The poem, Laments to the Death of Guillaume Peraza, is still widely known throughout the Canaries to this present day. Hernan Peraza had lost his only son, and nearly lost his claim to the unconquered islands, if not for his last remaining child, Ines Peraza. A few months after the death of her brother, Ines Peraza is married to a Spanish nobleman named Diego Garcia de Herrera. Shortly after this marriage, the couple are shipped off to join her father as he continues in his Canarian obsession. Hernan Peraza would manage to consolidate his rule in El Hierro and found a city on La Gomera to contest the Portuguese trading fort on the north side of that island. In 1450 and 1452, Portuguese and their Guanche allies would attack Peraza on La Gomera. These small-scale battles would be wholly inconclusive and amount to little more than needless bloodshed. Eventually, this small-scale war over La Gomera would bleed out into the Atlantic Ocean. In 1452, a naval battle between two ships would take place, one being under the flag of Portugal, the other Castile. The Portuguese would capture the Castilian ship, taking their sailors and treasure back to Portugal in what seemed to be an act of piracy. The Canary Islands was making both countries froth at the mouth. Neither would let the other have them without at least a fight. The main financier for Portugal's Canarian expeditions was probably one of the most famous Portuguese men to never become king. You know him best as Prince Henry the Navigator. Like Hernan Peraza, Prince Henry had a small obsession with the islands. For him, they would act as a vital outpost to explore more of the oceans that surrounded the African continent. In late 1452, the Castilian lord of the Canary Islands, Hernan Peraza, would die at the age of 62, leaving his lordship to his only living child, Ines Peraza, who is now the Lady of the Canary Islands. Along with her husband, Diego Garcia de Herrera, the couple would rule over the four islands from La Gomera. This title of lady did not suit Ines Peraza, however. In her own letters, she would address herself as Queen of the Canary Islands, which, yeah, that definitely has more of a ring to it. Although she would never proclaim herself as an independent queen, but one under the lordship of Castile. 2 years later, in 1454, the Portuguese hold over La Gomera was broken, and Prince Henry the Navigator was forced to abandon his claims over the Canaries. The Guanche on La Gomera, unlike on the other islands, would not so much be conquered as they would come to an agreement with Queen Peraza over her lordship of the islands. This is really the only exception to the otherwise brutal conquest of these islands, but it wouldn't even last forever. For 12 years, the Peraza-Herrera hold over the islands would continue, although with occasional Guanche revolts that would be viciously put down. Over those 12 years, the Peraza-Herrera family would grow. In all, the couple would have 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. In 1476, the first island to be conquered, Lanzarote, would rise up in a rebellion. But it wasn't the native Guanche this time. Instead, it was the Europeans on the island. The people on Lanzarote were apparently fed up with the Queen's governance. They petitioned for Queen Isabella of Castile, asking her to become the ruler of Lanzarote. The rebels continued, even as Queen Peraza sent her husband to execute and exile their ringleaders. The Lanzarote uprising did not go unnoticed in Spain. Queen Isabella sent a private investigator to the island to observe the rebellion and punch holes in Queen Peraza's lordship over the Canaries. By October of 1477, this private investigator manages to come to an agreement that Queen Isabella would be proud of. Likely with a good deal of threats, Queen Ines Peraza agrees to give up her family's claims to the unconquered islands of La Palma, Gran Canaria, and Tenerife, therefore giving the rights to conquer the islands directly to the Castilian crown. In that same year, Queen Peraza would start to divide her islands among her children. To her eldest, Pedro, she granted El Hierro, while La Gomera went to her second-born, named after her father, Hernan Peraza the Younger. This Hernan Peraza, much like his namesake, was very protective and borderline obsessed with his island. After an incident in 1481 that would see a Castilian captain dead on the orders of Hernan the Younger, the Lord of La Gomera would be forced back to Spain to explain his rash actions. By this time, Isabella of Castile had married Ferdinand II of Aragon, and the two kingdoms were now as one, being called the Kingdom of Spain. He pleaded for their forgiveness and was granted that, under one condition. He was to take the spot of the captain that he had killed in the conquest of the island of Gran Canaria. The conquest had already begun in 1478. Hernan Peraza the Younger did his part in assisting the Castilian commanders on the island. Namely, the younger Peraza would meet Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, future conqueror of the remaining Canaries, for the first time. The conquest of Gran Canaria would be completed in 1483, and Hernan Peraza the Younger was allowed to return to La Gomera. Not only was he now the Lord of La Gomera, but for the past year, he was also granted lordship over his brother's island of El Hierro. In 1482, the eldest of Ines Peraza's children, Pedro, attempted to assassinate his parents. This plot would fail and would only result in the title of Lord being stripped away from him and his exile to Spain. 4 years later, in 1486, Hernan Peraza the Younger would become besieged in the fort that Hernan Peraza the Elder had built on La Gomera. The Guanche on the island, which, might I remind you, were subjugated mostly in a peaceful manner, rose up against the harsh treatment of the Perazas. Their numbers were still largely intact, and Hernan Peraza could do nothing as his position became more dire day by day in his fort. Eventually, he managed to get a letter out to the governor of Gran Canaria. He arrived to relieve the Perazas and defeated the Guanche, enslaving many of them and reversing the mostly peaceful subjugation of La Gomera. They were not finished, however. The Guanche continued to resist, delving deeper inland and gathering their strength. They rallied around a man named Hatacaperche. He had a personal reason to hate Hernan Peraza, as he was having an affair with one of Hatacaperche's cousins. His grudge was personal, so Hatacaperche met him personally. In 1488, the Guanche warrior waited for Hernan Peraza as he exited his fort. He made his intentions clear, brandishing a long wooden spear, and after a quick verbal exchange, Hatacaperche throws his projectile with pinpoint accuracy into Peraza. He would die of his wounds, and his islands would be passed on to his wife, the widowed lady of El Hierro and La Gomera, Beatriz. Much to the dismay of the other lady of the Canaries, she continued governing the islands following her husband's death, as she would become the regent for their 8-year-old son. 1492 is for the most part remembered as the year that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, but he was not the only Spanish-sponsored mission in that year. On top of Columbus, Isabella and Ferdinand also gave permission to conquer the island of La Palma to Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, the same man that had helped in the conquest of Gran Canaria. Both Columbus and de Lugo left Spain, both in the direction of the Canary Islands. For Columbus, he landed on La Gomera, which was still under the regency of Beatriz. This was his last stop before sailing into the unknown. He only planned to stay a few days. Perhaps out of fear, or love for La Gomera, he would end up staying on the island for a month. But if I had to guess, it was probably due to fear. If this doesn't signify the Canary Islands as being the stepping stone from old to new worlds, then I'm not sure what does. On his third voyage west, Columbus would stop at La Gomera again. For De Lugo, he was going to La Palma, the island that Ines Peraza and so many others had died trying to capture. Isabella and Ferdinand offered De Lugo 700,000 gold pieces if he could conquer La Palma within the space of a year from landing. He set out to do just that, and on September 29th of 1492, he landed on the island. The race was on. At first, the conquest was a simple alliance spree with the Guanche on the coast. But as they ventured further inland, the hilly, rough terrain gave way to hundreds of Guanche, ready to defend La Palma. They were led by a chief named Tanasu. He controlled a mountain pass that was more than defensible. After months of siege and defeats at the hands of Tanasu, De Lugo starts to fear that he will not receive his year-end bonus. That would just be a tragedy. So he does what conquistadors do best: lie. In the late summer, he invites Tanasu to a meeting that was supposed to discuss peace. Instead, they capture the chief and send him back to Spain. After months of siege on La Palma, the chief was already malnourished. Before arriving on Spanish shores, Tanasu would die of starvation. Alonso Fernandez de Lugo was granted his 700,000 gold piece bonus, conquering La Palma in under a year's time. Now, only one island remained, Tenerife, and it was the largest and most populated of all. We will cover this final conquest very soon, but for now, let's fast forward a little bit to catch up with Queen Ines Peraza. She had remained in the Canaries this whole time, still governing Lanzarote and Fuerteventura. Her husband, Diego Garcia de Herrera, had died some years ago. In 1502, the 78-year-old Queen Ines knew that she was soon to follow. Making sure to be completely equal this time around, she split the land on her remaining islands between her 3 children that weren't dead and didn't try to kill her. Sancho, Constanza, and Maria continue to govern in her place. This being settled, the queen left her kingdom to end her story where it had started. She made it back to Seville by 1503, and the 79-year-old Ines would die within the year. The life of Queen Ines Peraza is in many ways a tragedy. From her brother's early death, to her father's obsession with the islands that had killed him, and all the way to the betrayal of one of her sons and another's death. The legacy of this tragic life would live on through her grandchildren, through her son, Hernan Peraza. Hernan, named after his grandfather, would in turn name his 2 children as Hernan Peraza the Elder had. The boy would be named Guillaume, and he would govern La Gomera and El Hierro, while his daughter, Ines, would marry the son of Alonso Fernandez de Lugo, and together, the couple would come to govern the island of La Palma and Tenerife. What's that thing they always say about history rhyming?